Welcome back to Faithful Tales. Before we jump into today's incredible story, if these sacred tales inspire you, please like, comment, and subscribe, and help me reach 1,000 faithful followers by December. Your support keeps these amazing stories coming. Now let's discover today's tale of faith. The bronze was cold against her lips, but Teresa's heart blazed like a furnace. In that instant, March 18th, 1560, at precisely dawn, the 39-year-old Carmelite nun felt the very foundations of reality shift beneath her knees. What began as a simple kiss of devotion became a collision between heaven and earth that would echo through eternity. But this moment didn't arise from nowhere. It was the culmination of a mystery that began in the scorching wilderness 3 millennia earlier, when death itself stalked the chosen people. The serpents came at night, silent, deadly. Their fangs carried venom that killed within hours, turning strong men into writhing shadows before stealing their final breath. Moses watched his people die by the hundreds, their bodies littering the desert sand like fallen leaves. The air filled with the stench of death and the sound of mourning mothers. Children wept over their fathers. Wives collapsed beside their husbands. The great exodus that had begun with such hope was becoming a cemetery in the wilderness. The complaints against God had stopped. Terror had silenced every voice of dissent. Now there was only screaming, and the desperate prayers of a people watching their dream of the promised land die one bite at a time. Moses climbed Mount Sinai with tears streaming down his weathered face. How could he explain to the Almighty that the children of Abraham were being destroyed by creatures no bigger than a man's arm? How could he beg for mercy when he himself had doubted God's provision just days before? Then came the voice that changed everything. "Make a serpent," God commanded, his words carrying both judgment and mercy, "and set it on a pole. Everyone who is bitten, when they see it, shall live." Moses felt his knees buckle. Make an image of the very thing that was killing them? Fashion in bronze the form of their destroyer? It made no sense. Yet faith had never been about understanding. It was about obedience. With trembling hands, Moses worked the bronze in the desert heat. The metal fought him at first, resisting his attempts to shape it into the sinuous form of a serpent. Sweat poured down his face as he hammered and molded, creating an image so realistic it seemed ready to strike. When he finally lifted it high on its wooden staff, something impossible happened. The first to look was a young soldier named Asher, whose leg had swollen to twice its normal size from a bite received just hours before. His wife had already begun preparing his burial shroud when Moses raised the bronze serpent. Asher lifted his eyes, and in that moment of desperate faith, watched his flesh return to normal. The blackened veins faded. The fever broke. Death released its grip. Word spread through the camp like wildfire. Men and women on the verge of death looked upon the bronze serpent and found their wounds healed, their blood cleansed, their lives restored. But this was no mere medical miracle. This was prophecy written in bronze and blood, a shadow cast backward from Calvary's hill. The wooden pole would become a Roman cross. The bronze serpent would become the Son of God. And the healing that came through looking would become salvation that came through believing. 15 centuries later, in a moonlit garden outside Jerusalem, this mystery reached its climax. A young rabbi named Jesus hung suspended between earth and sky, his body broken, his blood flowing, his life ebbing away. The bronze serpent had become flesh. The healing pole had become a tree of execution. And in that moment of supreme agony, the deadliest venom of all, human sin, was neutralized forever. The Roman soldiers who drove the nails thought they were simply executing another criminal. The religious leaders who orchestrated his death believed they were protecting their authority. But cosmic forces were at work that night. Every prophecy was being fulfilled. Every symbol was finding its substance. Every shadow was revealing its reality. As Jesus breathed his last, the veil in the temple tore from top to bottom. Graves opened. Dead saints walked the streets of Jerusalem. The earth itself convulsed in recognition that something unprecedented had occurred. The bronze serpent that had saved bodies in the wilderness had given way to the crucified Christ who would save souls throughout eternity. This was the theological foundation that would captivate a Spanish girl born 5 centuries later in the walled city of Ávila. Teresa de Ávila y Ahumada entered the world on March 28, 1515, during a thunderstorm that shook the ancient stones of her family's mansion. Lightning split the sky as she drew her first breath, and thunder rolled across the mountains as if the heavens themselves were announcing something significant. Her first cry, according to her nurse, was unusually strong, as if she were already arguing with someone. This would prove prophetic. The Spain of Teresa's childhood was a land of extremes. The Reconquista had recently expelled the Moors after 8 centuries of occupation. Columbus had opened the New World just 23 years before her birth. The Inquisition prowled the streets, searching for heretics and conversos who might be secretly practicing Judaism. It was an age of expansion and contraction, of glory and fear, of saints and sinners walking the same cobblestone streets. Teresa's father, Alonso Sanchez de Cepeda, was a converso, a Jew who had converted to Christianity to escape persecution. This family secret would haunt Teresa throughout her life, as converso blood was considered tainted by Spanish society. Her mother, Beatriz d'Ávila y Ahumada, came from old Christian nobility, and the marriage represented both love and social strategy. The household was deeply religious, but not oppressively so. Evening prayers were common, but so was laughter. Books filled the family library, not just religious texts, but also the chivalric romances that fired young imaginations. Teresa devoured these tales of knights and ladies, of quests and conquests, of love that transcended death itself. But it was the stories of saints and martyrs that truly captured her heart. At age 7, she convinced her brother Rodrigo to run away with her to Muslim lands, hoping they might die gloriously for Christ and go straight to heaven without the inconvenience of living through middle age. "We'll be martyrs," Teresa explained to her 11-year-old brother as they packed bread and dried fruit for their journey. "The Moors will cut off our heads, and we'll see God forever and ever." Rodrigo, always game for adventure, agreed to the plan. They made it precisely to the edge of town before their uncle intercepted them and dragged them home by their ears. "But the martyrs see God forever and ever," Teresa protested through her tears as her uncle deposited them at their parents' door. "There are other ways to see God, little one," her uncle replied, not knowing he was speaking prophecy that would unfold decades later in a convent chapel. After the martyrdom plan failed, Teresa turned to playing hermit with Rodrigo, building stone cells in the family garden where they would pretend to be desert fathers praying in solitude. She was drawn to extremes even then. Total commitment or nothing at all. Half measures held no appeal for a heart that burned with such intensity. Teresa's comfortable childhood shattered when she was 14. Her mother, Beatriz, died suddenly after a brief illness that began with simple fatigue and ended with violent seizures. The physicians could do nothing but watch as life drained from a woman who had been vibrant just weeks before. Standing beside the fresh grave in the family cemetery, the grief-stricken teenager felt something break inside her chest. Her mother had been her closest confidant, the one person who understood her mystical inclinations and dramatic temperament. Now that understanding presence was gone, leaving behind only cold earth and the smell of funeral flowers. In her desperation, Teresa made a plea that echoed across the cemetery and up to heaven itself. "Holy Virgin, since I no longer have a mother on earth, please be my mother now. Take care of me as she would have done." Mary heard that prayer, though her answer would come in ways Teresa could never have imagined. The loss of her mother marked the end of Teresa's innocent childhood and the beginning of a turbulent adolescence. Her father, overwhelmed with grief and the responsibility of raising 10 children alone, became emotionally distant. The household that had once buzzed with warmth and laughter grew cold and formal. Teresa began spending time with cousins who introduced her to the romantic literature that was sweeping through Spanish noble society. She read tales of passionate love affairs, secret meetings, and dramatic escapes. These stories awakened desires she didn't fully understand, but couldn't resist exploring. By age 16, Teresa had developed what she later called a dangerous friendship with a male cousin. They exchanged letters, met in secret, and engaged in conversations that pushed the boundaries of propriety. Nothing seriously sinful occurred, but Teresa's reputation began to suffer. Whispers followed her through the halls of her father's house. Recognizing the danger, her father made a painful decision. He sent Teresa to the Augustinian convent of Santa Maria de Gracia, not as a nun, but as a student in their boarding school. It was a way of protecting her reputation while giving her time to mature away from corrupting influences. Teresa hated every moment of it. The strict schedule, the plain food, the endless prayers, all of it felt like prison to a girl accustomed to freedom and excitement. She spent her first months plotting escape and writing passionate letters to friends about her suffering. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, something began to change. Sister Maria de Briceño, the elderly nun assigned as Teresa's mentor, possessed a quiet wisdom that gradually penetrated Teresa's defensive walls. During their daily walks in the convent garden, this patient woman shared stories of saints who had found in religious life not prison, but freedom. Freedom from the shallow pursuits that ultimately left souls empty. The world promises much, but delivers little, Sister Maria observed one afternoon as they paused beside a fountain where goldfish swam in lazy circles. God promises little, but delivers everything. These words lodged in Teresa's heart like seeds waiting for the right season to sprout. After a year and a half at the school, Teresa returned home with her father's permission to consider her future. Marriage was the expected path for a young woman of her class, and several advantageous matches were available. But something had shifted during her time with the Augustinians. The idea of spending her life managing a household and bearing children felt suddenly hollow. Still, the religious life held no strong appeal either. Teresa had seen too many unhappy nuns going through the motions of devotion without any apparent joy or peace. If she was going to be miserable, she reasoned, she might as well be miserable with money and social status. The decision tormented her for months. She prayed for guidance but heard only silence. She sought counsel from priests but received conflicting advice. Finally, in a moment of desperate clarity, she made her choice. She would enter religious life not from burning spiritual passion, but from reasoned calculation. It seemed the safer path for her eternal soul, even if it promised little happiness for her earthly life. At 20 years old, Teresa entered the convent of the Incarnation in Ávila. As she walked through the massive oak doors for the first time, she later recalled feeling as if all my bones were being dislocated. She was dying to one life and being born into another, though she had no idea what that new life would bring. The convent of the Incarnation was unlike anything Teresa had imagined a monastery should be. It housed nearly 200 nuns from Spain's most prominent families, making it more like a religious city than a traditional cloister. Many sisters maintained private apartments complete with servants. Social visiting was common. The discipline was relaxed, the spirituality lukewarm, and the atmosphere more aristocratic than ascetic. Teresa thrived in this environment initially. Her quick wit, charming personality, and noble connections made her one of the most popular sisters. She wore silk undergarments beneath her habit, used expensive perfumes, and entertained visitors with stories that had them laughing until their sides ached. But her prayer life remained dutiful rather than inspired. She would kneel in the chapel for the required periods, rosary in hand, mind wandering to letters she needed to write or visits she was expecting. The spiritual exercises that were supposed to bring her closer to God felt like climbing a mountain in heavy armor, exhausting and seemingly pointless. For 20 years, Teresa coasted through religious life like a comfortable passenger on a ship heading nowhere in particular. She was neither particularly holy nor particularly sinful, neither miserable nor joyful. She had achieved that most dangerous of spiritual states, mediocrity. Then illness struck with devastating force. Teresa's health had always been delicate, but in her late 30s, she began experiencing symptoms that baffled physicians. Severe headaches left her bedridden for days. Mysterious fevers came and went without apparent cause. Her heart would race for hours, then beat so slowly she feared it might stop altogether. Some in the convent whispered that her illness was psychological, the result of a guilty conscience or suppressed desires. Others suggested it was divine punishment for her lukewarm devotion. Teresa herself wondered if God was trying to tell her something through her suffering, but she couldn't decipher the message. The worst part wasn't the physical pain, but the spiritual aridity that accompanied it. Prayer became not just difficult, but torturous. She would kneel in the chapel watching the clock, counting the minutes until she could escape. Books about saints filled her with guilt rather than inspiration. She felt like a fraud, going through the motions of devotion while her heart remained cold as winter stone. By 1554, at age 39, Teresa found herself in the deepest spiritual crisis of her life. She had spent nearly 2 decades in religious life and had almost nothing to show for it. Her prayer was mechanical. Her devotion was superficial. Her knowledge of God was purely intellectual. She felt further from heaven than she had as a teenager reading romance novels. It was during this dark period that Lent arrived with its emphasis on penance and spiritual renewal. The convent traditionally acquired special devotional objects for the season, and this year was no exception. The statue that appeared in the chapel was unlike anything Teresa had seen before. It was a representation of Christ after the scourging, not the sanitized, peaceful Jesus of most religious art, but a man destroyed by suffering. His body was covered with wounds from the Roman flagellum, that terrible whip embedded with pieces of bone and metal designed to rip flesh from bone. Blood streamed from countless gashes. His face, swollen and barely recognizable, spoke of agony beyond human endurance. Teresa stopped breathing. In 39 years of life, 20 of them spent in a convent surrounded by religious images, she had never truly seen what Jesus endured for love of humanity. Oh, she knew the story intellectually. She could recite the Passion narrative from memory. She had meditated on the sufferings of Christ countless times. But seeing this realistic depiction hit her like a physical blow to the chest. The comfortable distance she had maintained from Christ's passion collapsed in an instant. This wasn't ancient history or theological concept. This was brutal reality. A real man had endured real torture for real love of real people, including her. The God of the universe had allowed himself to be reduced to broken flesh and flowing blood because he couldn't bear the thought of losing her to sin and death. Tears began streaming down her face. Not the gentle tears of sentimental piety, but the violent sobs of a woman confronting her own heart for the first time. All her comfortable assumptions about faith crumbled in that moment. All her casual approaches to devotion withered in the face of such love. She fell to her knees, overwhelmed by a tidal wave of emotions she had never experienced with such intensity. Gratitude mixed with shame. Love collided with desire. Wonder battled with unworthiness. All of it swirled together in a torrent that left her gasping for breath and grasping for something solid to hold on to. That's when she noticed the small crucifix beside the statue. It was perhaps 6 inches tall, made of bronze that had been polished by countless hands over countless years. Nothing particularly remarkable about it. Similar crucifixes adorned cells throughout the convent. But in her current state of emotional vulnerability, it seemed to glow with inner light. Without conscious thought, her trembling hand reached for it. The bronze was warm from the chapel's candles, worn smooth by decades of devotional touches. She lifted it slowly, reverently, intending nothing more than a simple gesture of love and gratitude. As she brought it closer to her face, she could see every detail of the craftsman's work. The crown of thorns pressed into the bronze forehead, the nails piercing the hands and feet, the wound in the side where the Roman spear had thrust. Each mark told the story of love beyond comprehension. Teresa closed her eyes and pressed her lips to the feet of the crucified Christ. The moment her mouth touched the bronze, lightning struck. Not literal lightning, though Teresa later swore it felt exactly like being struck by divine electricity. Every nerve in her body came alive simultaneously. Her vision blurred, then sharpened to supernatural clarity. Her heart raced wildly, then settled into a rhythm that seemed synchronized with eternity itself. Time stopped. Or perhaps she stepped outside of time entirely. The chapel around her faded into irrelevance as she found herself in a place that existed beyond physical dimensions. She was still kneeling on the stone floor, still holding the crucifix, but she was also somewhere else entirely, a realm where thoughts became visible, where emotions had color and texture, where truth blazed with the intensity of 1,000 suns. And then came the knowledge. It didn't arrive gradually like normal learning, but flooded her consciousness like water bursting through a broken dam. Understanding about mysteries she had never even thought to question filled her mind with dazzling clarity. In the space of a heartbeat that lasted hours, she comprehended 8 profound truths about what happens every time a person kisses a crucifix with genuine devotion. The first truth blazed in her consciousness with the force of revelation. Every reverent kiss cleanses the soul of venial sins. Teresa saw it as clearly as if watching a physical process. The accumulated dust of daily living, small selfishnesses, petty irritations, spiritual laziness, moments of impatience or unkindness, all of it was washed away in an instant. Not the serious transgressions that sever communion with God entirely, but the 1,000 tiny compromises that gradually dim the soul's brightness. She witnessed souls across centuries performing this simple act and emerging purified, their spiritual clarity restored, their capacity for love enhanced. It wasn't magic. She understood immediately. The power lay in the kiss itself, only when it emerged from genuine love and contrition. Empty gestures carried no force. Mechanical repetition accomplished nothing. But when the heart was truly engaged, when the will was genuinely surrendered, when the entire person was present in that moment of sacred contact, then the impossible became routine. The second truth followed immediately. The kiss awakened spiritual senses that most people never know they possess. Teresa gasped as her inner world exploded into vivid reality. Where before prayer had been like shouting into an empty room, she now heard the gentle whisper of the beloved responding to her every thought. Where before spiritual reading had been dry academic exercise, the words now pulsed with living meaning that made her heart race with excitement. It was as if she had been spiritually blind and deaf her entire life, and this single kiss had restored senses she didn't know she was missing. Colors had new vibrancy. Sounds carried deeper meaning. Even the air in the chapel seemed charged with divine presence. The veil between the natural and supernatural worlds had become transparent, allowing her to perceive realities that had always been there, but remained hidden from ordinary sight. The third truth concerned what Teresa immediately understood as the multiplication of merit. Every prayer, every act of kindness, every moment of patience or forgiveness performed after kissing the crucifix with devotion carried amplified spiritual power. She saw it like connecting to a divine power source that energized everything that followed. Apart from Christ, human beings could accomplish nothing of eternal value. Their best efforts remained tainted by selfishness and limitation. But connected to Him through this sacred gesture, even the smallest acts became spiritually fruitful. The widow's mite became greater than the rich man's fortune. The cup of cold water carried the weight of eternal significance. The morning kiss established this connection for the entire day, like tuning an instrument to perfect pitch so that every note played afterward would be harmonious. Conversations became opportunities for grace. Work became worship. Suffering became sacrifice. The ordinary was transfigured into the extraordinary through this simple point of contact with infinite love. The fourth truth involved protection from temptation in ways that transcended normal human willpower. As this knowledge filled her mind, Teresa saw in vivid detail how those who kissed the crucifix each morning received supernatural strength to resist the day's trials. It wasn't that temptation disappeared. If anything, the forces of darkness might attack more fiercely those who drew so close to light. But the soul gained divine clarity, to recognize deception and divine power, to choose correctly. She witnessed countless souls facing moments of moral crisis. The businessman tempted to cheat, the wife considering adultery, the priest battling despair. Those who had begun their day with this sacred kiss found themselves equipped with wisdom beyond their natural capacity and strength, beyond their normal limits. The kiss became a form of spiritual armor, not making them invulnerable, but making them invincible through divine grace. The fifth truth was cosmic in scope and staggering in its implications. Every kiss generates prayers for souls departing earthly life at that exact moment. Teresa's consciousness expanded to encompass the entire globe. Somewhere in the world, she realized with overwhelming clarity, people were drawing their final breaths at every instant. In hospital beds and battlefields, in homes and streets, souls were facing the awesome reality of divine judgment with all eternity hanging in the balance. The love shown to Christ through kissing the crucifix somehow obtained mercy for these departing souls, even those completely unknown to the person offering the devotion. Each kiss became a prayer that reached across continents and cultures, extending grace to strangers in their hour of greatest need. She saw the mystical body of Christ as a living network where every act of love sent ripples of grace throughout the entire organism. No devotional gesture was merely private. Every sincere expression of affection toward God affected souls across the globe in ways that would only be fully revealed in eternity. The communion of saints wasn't just a theological concept, but a living reality where love shared anywhere, blessed souls everywhere. The sixth truth transformed Teresa's understanding of suffering in ways that would revolutionize her remaining years. Kissing the crucifix before enduring pain united that suffering with Christ's passion. Physical ailments, emotional distress, spiritual darkness, all the inevitable hardships of human existence could be transformed from meaningless burdens into redemptive offerings. But the key was the word before. The kiss had to precede the suffering to be most effective, requiring faith to believe that coming trials could be united with divine love before they even arrived. Teresa saw souls throughout history who had learned this secret. They faced persecution with joy, endured illness with peace, and met death with confidence, not because they were naturally brave, but because they had connected their sufferings to the infinite merits of Christ's passion through this simple gesture of love. It was like signing a blank check and allowing God to fill in the amount. The soul offered whatever pain the day might bring, and God transformed it into spiritual currency of incalculable value. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was meaningless. Every tear became a prayer, every difficulty a doorway to deeper union with the crucified one. The seventh truth blazed with healing power. The kiss could mend even the deepest spiritual wounds. These weren't physical ailments, but the injuries that life inflicts on the human heart: betrayal by trusted friends, abandonment by loved ones, abuse by those meant to protect, the countless ways that trust can be shattered and hope can die. Teresa saw how Christ's wounds, when reverently touched through the crucifix, carried power to heal even ancient hurts that seemed beyond remedy. She understood that it worked through a divine exchange. Human wounds met divine wounds, and in that contact, healing flowed from the eternal to the temporal. It wasn't always instant. Some injuries required repeated touch over months or years, but it was always certain for those who persevered in faith. The one who had been wounded for humanity's transgressions specialized in transforming wounds into sources of strength. The bronze feet she was kissing had been pierced by Roman nails. The body she was reverencing had been broken by human cruelty. Yet those very wounds had become the means of salvation for countless millions. In the same way, human wounds touched by divine love could become sources of healing for others still suffering. The eighth and final truth was the most mystical and overwhelming of all. In the moment of sacred contact, heaven bends down to earth in ways that temporarily suspend the normal laws of spiritual physics. The kiss becomes a prayer that pierces through all layers of earthly reality, past the atmosphere, past the stars, past the very boundaries of the created universe, and reaches the throne of God Himself. Angels witness the gesture and rejoice over it. Saints throughout eternity take notice and add their intercession to the simple offering. The Sacred Heart of Jesus beats with renewed love for all humanity, as each kiss reminds Him afresh of why His sacrifice was worthwhile. Time and eternity touch in that moment. The finite and infinite embrace. The human and divine merge in a communion so profound that it temporarily transforms the person offering the kiss into a living prayer. For just an instant, the soul experiences what the saints in heaven experience constantly: direct contact with the source of all love, all beauty, all truth. Teresa found herself weeping with joy at the magnificence of what was being revealed. This simple gesture that she had performed casually hundreds of times contained depths of meaning that could occupy a lifetime of contemplation. Every crucifix in every church and home was a doorway to divine encounter. Every mourning presented an opportunity for cosmic significance. Every kiss offered to the wounds of Christ sent shockwaves of grace throughout the universe. These 8 revelations didn't unfold gradually over hours of meditation. They blazed through Teresa's consciousness in the time it takes to draw a single breath. One moment she was an ordinary nun struggling with spiritual dryness. The next, she possessed understanding that would revolutionize not only her own spiritual life, but the lives of millions who would follow her teaching. When awareness of her physical surroundings slowly returned, Teresa found herself lying prostrate on the chapel floor. The crucifix was still clutched against her heart, now warm from the heat of her body. Candles that had been tall when she entered were now burned down to stubs, their wax pooled on the floor around her. Hours had passed without her awareness, yet it felt like she had experienced an entire lifetime in those moments of mystical union. But time meant nothing compared to the transformation she felt within. The spiritual desert of her previous 20 years had become a garden blooming with supernatural life. The silence that had tortured her was now filled with divine conversation that made her heart sing. The emptiness that had haunted her was overflowing with love so abundant she felt she might burst from the sheer volume of grace contained within her soul. From that day forward, Teresa's life became a living testament to the power of her revelation. She rose each morning before dawn broke over the mountains of Ávila, sought out her treasured crucifix, and pressed it to her lips with the same reverence she would show if kissing the actual wounds of the risen Christ. The effects were immediate and undeniable. Her prayer life exploded into mystical experiences that left her speechless with wonder. Her understanding of Scripture deepened daily as verses that had been opaque for decades suddenly blazed with meaning. Her capacity for love expanded until she felt her heart might literally burst from the weight of divine affection flowing through it. But Teresa was no dreamy mystic lost in clouds of sentiment. She was a practical woman with administrative genius who tested her revelations against the harsh realities of daily life. She began carefully teaching the practice to other nuns, observing the results with the analytical eye of a natural scientist. Sister Maria de San Jose, who became Teresa's closest companion and eventual successor, left detailed records of what she witnessed during those early years after Teresa's transformation. I watched our Holy Mother approach the crucifix each morning, as if approaching the throne of God Himself. Her face would be radiant with anticipation, her hands trembling slightly with the intensity of her devotion. When she pressed her lips to the bronze feet of Christ, the change in her was immediate and unmistakable. Tears would stream down her cheeks, not tears of sadness, but of overwhelming joy and gratitude. Often the crucifix itself seemed to glow with inner light during these moments, though perhaps that was the reflection of the divine radiance that seemed to emanate from Mother Teresa herself. She would remain in this state of communion for varying lengths of time, sometimes just a few minutes, other times for an hour or more. When she finally opened her eyes, she would be filled with energy and peace that lasted the entire day. The transformation in her daily life was even more remarkable than these mystical experiences. Her counsel became supernaturally wise. She could see straight to the heart of any problem and offer solutions that none of us would have thought possible. Her patience seemed unlimited, even with the most difficult sisters. Her joy was so infectious that the entire atmosphere of our convent changed. It was as if touching Christ each morning recharged her entire being with divine power. Word of Teresa's transformation spread beyond the convent walls like ripples from a stone thrown into still water. Lay people began seeking her guidance, drawn by reports of her extraordinary wisdom and apparent holiness. To each one, she shared her revelation about the crucifix, tailoring her instruction to their particular circumstances and spiritual needs. The testimonies that followed defied easy explanation and challenged the assumptions of even skeptical observers. Doña Ana de Mendoza, a wealthy noblewoman struggling with a marriage that had grown cold and bitter, wrote to Teresa after several months of practicing the devotion, "Reverend Mother, I must share with you the miraculous changes that have occurred in my household since I began following your counsel about the morning kiss of the crucifix. When I first wrote to you, my husband and I barely spoke except to argue. Our children were rebellious and disrespectful. Our servants grumbled constantly and performed their duties with obvious resentment. I confess that your advice seemed almost insultingly simple. Kiss a crucifix each morning? How could such a small gesture address problems that had been growing for years? But I was desperate enough to try anything, and I had heard too many stories of your wisdom to dismiss your counsel entirely. The first morning I felt somewhat foolish, but I approached the crucifix in our private chapel with as much faith as I could muster. As I pressed my lips to Christ's wounded feet, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, a sense of peace that seemed to settle into my very bones. The change in my day was immediate. Where I would normally have responded to my husband's coldness with equal coldness, I found myself speaking gently. When our youngest son spilled wine on my new dress, instead of scolding him, I found myself laughing and helping him clean up the mess. By evening, the entire atmosphere of our home felt different. Within a week, my husband began joining me for morning prayers, something he hadn't done since the early years of our marriage. Our children, sensing the change in our relationship, began opening their hearts to us again. Even our servants began working with joy rather than resentment. It has now been 6 months since I began this practice, and I can honestly say that our household has been transformed beyond recognition. We laugh together again. We pray together again. We love each other again. All from a simple kiss offered to Christ each dawn. Similar testimonies poured in from across Spain and eventually from throughout Catholic Europe. A merchant in Seville reported that his business dealings became more honest and profitable after adopting Teresa's practice. A mother in Barcelona wrote that her relationship with her difficult teenage daughter was completely restored. A priest in Valencia claimed that his homilies improved dramatically, and his parishioners began approaching him for spiritual direction in unprecedented numbers. Father Geronimo Gracian, Teresa's confessor and spiritual director, initially approached these reports with healthy skepticism. As a trained theologian and experienced pastor, he had seen too many spiritual fads come and go to be easily impressed. But Teresa's character was beyond reproach, and the consistency of the testimonies eventually convinced him to investigate more thoroughly. What he discovered shook his theological assumptions to their foundations. I have now observed this practice among Mother Teresa's spiritual children for over a decade, he wrote in his private journal. The effects are so consistent and so profound that I can no longer attribute them to coincidence or wishful thinking. Those who faithfully kiss the crucifix each morning with genuine devotion experience spiritual growth that would normally take years of intensive prayer and penance. But perhaps the most extraordinary claim Mother Teresa has made is that those who practice this devotion faithfully will never die without receiving the last sacraments of the Church. When she first told me this, I thought it too bold to believe. How could a simple morning practice guarantee such a specific grace? Yet in all the years since, among the dozens of her followers whose deaths I have personally witnessed or investigated, this promise has held true in every single case. Even those who died suddenly in accidents or who lived in remote areas where priests rarely visited somehow managed to receive final confession and communion before their passing. It defies natural explanation. As Teresa's reputation spread, she found herself at the center of both admiration and controversy. The Spanish Inquisition, always suspicious of mystical claims, investigated her for possible heresy. Theologians debated whether her experiences were genuine divine revelations or dangerous delusions. Church authorities demanded written accounts of her visions and spiritual practices. Through it all, Teresa remained remarkably humble about her discoveries. She insisted repeatedly that the power lay not in her teaching, but in Christ himself. The crucifix was simply a conduit for grace that had always been available to anyone with faith to access it. What she had found wasn't something new, but something ancient that had been overlooked or forgotten. She pointed to biblical precedents that supported her claims. The woman with the hemorrhage who touched Jesus' garment and was instantly healed understood the principle. Paul's handkerchiefs and aprons that brought healing to the sick demonstrated the same truth. Throughout Scripture, physical contact with sacred reality, when accompanied by genuine faith, could transmit divine power. But Teresa's teaching went deeper than mere contact with blessed objects. She understood that the kiss represented something profound about the nature of love itself. True love always seeks physical expression. A mother kisses her child not because the child needs the kiss for any practical purpose, but because maternal love demands tangible outlet. Lovers embrace not from necessity, but from the irrepressible overflow of affection that must find bodily form. In the same way, the soul that genuinely loves Christ cannot remain content with purely intellectual appreciation. Love must touch, must taste, must bridge the gap between spiritual longing and physical reality. The crucifix becomes the meeting point where eternal love takes temporal form, where the infinite makes itself accessible to finite creatures who think and feel through their senses. This understanding completely revolutionized Teresa's approach to prayer and spiritual direction. She moved away from the complicated mental exercises that had characterized her earlier attempts at contemplation. Gone were the elaborate methodologies that required years of training to master. In their place was what she called the prayer of loving attention, a simple focusing of affection on Christ present in the crucifix. Her Reformed Carmelite convents reflected this heart-centered spirituality. When Teresa began founding new monasteries, eventually 17 foundations before her death, each one emphasized genuine encounter over elaborate ritual, authentic emotion over mechanical observance, and the kind of intimacy with Christ that could find perfect expression in a simple kiss. The practice spread through Teresa's network of Reformed convents like fire through dry grass. Each new foundation received detailed instructions about the proper way to perform the devotion. Teresa had learned through years of careful observation that specific guidelines were essential to ensure the gesture remained authentic rather than becoming merely mechanical. These weren't arbitrary rules, but discoveries born from decades of experimentation and prayer. She had tested every variable, observed every outcome, and refined the practice until it achieved maximum spiritual effectiveness. First, the crucifix should be kissed immediately upon awakening each morning, before any other activity, even before getting dressed or washing. This established the proper spiritual tone for the entire day and ensured that the first conscious act was one of love toward Christ. Let your first thought be of Him, Teresa instructed her nuns, and your last thought will be of Him as well. Second, the kiss should be slow and deeply reverent, never hurried or absent-minded. Teresa recommended pausing to gaze into the face of the crucified Christ both before and after the kiss, maintaining conscious awareness of what the gesture represented. Look into His eyes, she would tell her spiritual daughters. See the love there. Let that love look back into your soul. Third, the kiss should be accompanied by a brief prayer of self-offering that acknowledged complete dependence on divine mercy. Teresa suggested simple words that became standard throughout her Reformed convents. My beloved, I give you this day and all it contains. Unite my will to yours in all things. Let nothing happen to me today that does not first pass through your sacred heart. Fourth, whenever possible, the same crucifix should be used each day, allowing for the development of familiarity and deeper spiritual association. Teresa believed that objects blessed by repeated devotional use became more effective conduits of grace. Several of her nuns reported that their personal crucifixes seemed to grow warmer to the touch over time, as if responding to years of faithful attention. Fifth, the practice should remain private rather than public whenever circumstances allowed. While Teresa had no objection to communal devotion, she felt that the morning kiss worked most powerfully as an intimate exchange between the individual soul and Christ, without the distractions that could come from awareness of observers. Finally, the devotion should be approached with expectant faith rather than mere routine. Do not kiss the crucifix wondering if it will work, Teresa counseled. Kiss it knowing that it always works, though not always in ways we can immediately perceive. These guidelines were tested and refined in Teresa's convents over decades of careful observation. The nuns who followed them most faithfully consistently reported the most dramatic spiritual growth. Those who treated the practice casually or modified it according to personal preference seemed to experience fewer of the extraordinary benefits Teresa had described. But Teresa's influence extended far beyond her Reformed Carmelite order. spiritual directors throughout Catholic Europe began recommending the practice to their directees. Bishops sought her counsel on mystical theology. Even Pope Pius V, who would later canonize her in 1622, was said to have adopted the devotion himself after reading her detailed descriptions of its effects. The Protestant Reformation was raging during Teresa's lifetime, and many of the reformers criticized Catholic devotional practices as superstitious or idolatrous. Teresa's teaching about kissing the crucifix provided a thoughtful response to these criticisms that impressed even some Protestant observers. She grounded the practice firmly in biblical principles, connected it to verifiable spiritual experiences, and emphasized that the power came from Christ himself, rather than from any magical properties of the physical object. Her approach influenced the Catholic Counter-Reformation's emphasis on authentic interior spirituality rather than mere external observance. The Council of Trent, which met during Teresa's lifetime, echoed many of her themes about the importance of heartfelt devotion accompanying traditional practices. As Teresa aged and her mystical experiences deepened rather than diminished, her understanding of the crucifix kiss continued to evolve in remarkable ways. In her final years, she claimed that the 8 revelations she had received that morning in 1560 were merely the beginning of what Christ wanted to communicate about this ancient practice. She spoke in veiled terms of additional insights that she wasn't yet permitted to reveal publicly. Mysteries so profound that they could only be understood by souls who had progressed far along the path of mystical union. She hinted that the kiss represented a foretaste of the beatific vision itself, that moment in eternity when the redeemed would see God face to face without any barrier or mediation. The temporary contact between human lips and the image of divine sacrifice, she wrote cryptically in her private journal, prefigures the eternal contact between the created soul and its uncreated source. In heaven, we will not need crucifixes because we will kiss the wounds themselves. Teresa's health, never robust, began declining seriously in her final years. The intense mystical experiences that had marked her mature spirituality took a physical toll that her aging body could no longer sustain. Yet rather than becoming an invalid lost in otherworldly contemplation, she remained actively involved in governing her convents and directing souls until her very last days. On October 3, 1582, Teresa woke with an unusual sense of anticipation. As was her custom for over 20 years, she reached for the crucifix that lived beside her bed, the same bronze crucifix she had kissed that transformative morning in 1560. But this time, as she pressed it to her lips, she lingered longer than usual. Sister Ana de San Bartolome, who was caring for the aging foundress, later reported that Teresa's final kiss of the crucifix seemed different from all the others she had witnessed. It was as if she were kissing someone goodbye, the sister recalled. There was such tenderness in the gesture, such finality, that I felt my heart skip a beat. Throughout that final day, Teresa spoke with unusual clarity about her approaching death, giving final instructions to her nuns and blessing each one individually. As evening approached, she asked to be taken to the chapel one last time. There, supported by 2 sisters, she gazed long at the large crucifix above the altar. "My Lord," she whispered, loud enough for those nearby to hear, "it is time to move on. Well then, may your will be done. O my Lord and my spouse, the hour that I have longed for has come. It is time for us to see each other face to face." She died peacefully in her cell just after midnight on October 4, 1582, at the age of 67. The crucifix she had used for her morning devotion was found beside her body, still warm from being pressed against her heart during her final moments. That small bronze crucifix became one of the most treasured relics of the Carmelite order. It was passed from convent to convent, before eventually being housed at the monastery in Ávila, where Teresa's spiritual journey had begun so many decades earlier. Pilgrims from around the world come to venerate it, and many report experiencing unusual warmth or consolation when they kiss it themselves. But Teresa's greatest legacy wasn't a relic, or even her extensive writings, as valuable as those have proven to be. Her most enduring gift to the Church was the simple practice she had discovered that morning in 1560, a practice that required no special training, cost nothing, and could be performed by anyone regardless of education, social status, or spiritual sophistication. For more than 4 centuries since Teresa's death, millions of believers have tested her claims through their own experience. The testimonies continue to accumulate in monastery archives, spiritual direction notes, and personal journals around the world. Marriages restored through couples who began kissing crucifixes together each morning. Addictions broken by individuals who found in this practice the strength to choose differently. Despair transformed into hope by souls who discovered divine love through the simple touch of bronze lips. Cancer patients who approach chemotherapy with supernatural peace after beginning their days with sacred kisses. Soldiers facing combat who carry pocket crucifixes and credit their survival to morning devotions performed in foxholes. Business executives who find their ethical standards elevated and their decisions guided by wisdom beyond their natural capabilities. The testimonies span cultures, centuries, and continents. A rice farmer in medieval Japan, a coal miner in industrial England, a computer programmer in modern Silicon Valley. All discovering the same truth Teresa had found, that faith expressed through the ancient gesture of sacred affection opens doorways to grace that transform ordinary lives into extraordinary stories of divine love. Modern skeptics dismiss such reports as coincidence, wishful thinking, or psychological placebo effects. But for those who have experienced the reality Teresa described, no explanation beyond her own is necessary. They know from personal experience what happens when human love meets divine love in the simple contact between grateful lips and the image of ultimate sacrifice. The Catholic Church, always cautious about mystical claims, has thoroughly investigated Teresa's life and teachings multiple times over the centuries. She was beatified in 1614, canonized in 1622, and declared a Doctor of the Church in 1970. One of only 4 women to receive this highest honor for theological insight and spiritual wisdom. Yet perhaps the most convincing validation of Teresa's revelation isn't found in official church documents, but in the countless ordinary believers who have discovered extraordinary grace through following her simple counsel. They represent every walk of life, every level of education, every degree of natural holiness or human frailty. What unites them all is the willingness to test Teresa's claims through personal experiment, to approach a crucifix each morning, not as distant observers but as beloved children, to kiss the symbol of salvation, not from mere obligation, but from genuine love, and to discover, as she did, that something beautiful always happens in that moment of sacred contact. The 8 revelations Teresa received weren't meant to be the final word on this ancient practice, but rather an invitation to personal discovery. Each morning presents a new opportunity to experience what she experienced, to learn what she learned, to join the invisible communion of souls who have found in this simple gesture a pathway to divine intimacy. The bronze is still cold to the touch in that first moment. The gesture still seems almost too simple to carry such profound significance. But for those who approach it with the faith of a Spanish mystic, who dared to believe that heaven notices every expression of human love, the ancient promise still holds true. In that kiss, heaven bends down to earth. Time touches eternity. The infinite embraces the finite, and the God who spoke the universe into existence whispers to each faithful soul the same words he once spoke through bronze serpents and wooden crosses. I have loved you with an everlasting love. Come to me, and I will give you rest. The secret Teresa discovered in a convent chapel on that March morning in 1560 remains as powerful today as it was 4.5 centuries ago. The invitation still stands open. The promise still waits to be claimed. And somewhere in the mystery that surrounds all genuine encounters with the divine, love is still waiting to meet love in the simple, sacred touch of human lips upon the wounds of eternal compassion. For those brave enough to test her revelation, for those humble enough to embrace such simple faith, for those desperate enough to try anything that might bridge the gap between human longing and divine love, the crucifix waits. And with it, all the grace that a single kiss can unlock in a heart prepared to receive what heaven longs to give. The assurance that we are loved beyond measure, without condition, and without end.